Okay.
There we go. So we
Turn my camera off, Rachel.
Okay, sounds good. So we kind of pulled some different questions from our members, questions that some of the board members had, and we're just going to kind of go through some of them. So first, can you tell us about your path into medicine, where you went to school, what you studied, kind of where you did your residency, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I am from Pakistan and I graduated from Punjab University. It's one of the oldest university in the country, over 150 years old. And right after my graduation, I came to United States. But when I was in my 10th grade, I just knew that I wanted to be a cancer researcher, a cancer doctor. I don't know why, but in my 10th grade, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And when I came to US, I went to do my residency at Columbia University and New York. And then I went for a specialized training in cancer medicine and cancer research. They are called fellowships. And so I did a blood fellowship, which is blood cancer fellowship. And I did a cancer fellowship. And then I did a research fellowship at NYU. And I love NYU. So I was in New York City for a long time. And then the first 2 years I did all clinical, seeing patients and research. And in the third and the fourth year, I stayed there and do laboratory research and grew cancer cells, treated cancer cells, see how they work and so forth. And that's where my training was. And after I finished my training, I went to Buffalo, New York. In Buffalo, there's a cancer center called Roswell Park Cancer Institute. It's one of the first cancer center of the world. It has a very, very strong history of cancer research. About 150 years ago, people had decided that cancer is a special disease and should be treated separately from other diseases. So they made a special cancer clinic there. And that's where I went and did a lot of my research and a lot of training. And then Mayo Clinic in 2011 asked me to come over as their chairman of the cancer department. And so I came over here.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. You said in 10th grade, you kind of knew that you wanted to be a cancer researcher. How did you kind of decide on that? And as you started doing different clinicals during med school, did you ever feel like you wavered in deciding that that was what specialty you wanted to go into?
So I think that I remember a few things. I used to read a lot of Reader's Digest and Discover magazine when I was before medical school. And I was fascinated about leukemia. I didn't really know that I will become a leukemia expert, but I was fascinated. In those days, there was nothing that was happening, and people were reporting, 6 months or 4 months patients would die for leukemia. There was no chemotherapy, and the treatments were horrible. And so I think it left an imprint on me and in Pakistan, there were no cancer doctors, zero at that time. And the only people who were taking care of cancer were surgeons, and all they could do was take it out. And blood cancers you can't take out. So, so I think somewhere it stayed with me. And when I went to medical school, I went to different departments, and at some point I was like, maybe cardiology, but I never could leave the cancer that was in my head. So when I came to United States, when I sent my application, everywhere in my application was like, I want to be a cancer doctor. And people were, in those days, were not very optimistic about cancer. And this, we're talking about 1990s. And AIDS was big. So when I went to Columbia University, AIDS was at its peak. Every single patient that I saw had AIDS, and it was a huge deal. And so I couldn't avoid AIDS as a clinician. So I started focusing on cancers of the AIDS patients. Some of my initial research work that's published and very talked about was how to treat cancer patients who also have AIDS. So I started working on AIDS and cancer because nobody wanted to touch these patients. They don't want to deal with it. It was a big dogma at that time. And so it was, God blessed me abundantly, and it was such a good experience to take care of those patients.
That's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's really interesting to see that it was kind of something you read and it just kind of was always in the back of your mind of knowing that's what you wanted to go into. Sarah's kind of told me a little bit about how you do a lot of research right now. And so we're just kind of curious on what are you working on your research, if you can tell us about it, that gives you hope for the future of cancer treatments.
Yes. So research, all these years, 25 years, I have been working in the cancer field, quarter of a century. And there are three big categories of research that I work in. Number one is that I just develop cancer drugs in the laboratory and do experiments on animals and cancer cells and figure out, like just before I started talking to you, my team is sitting in the conference room outside and we were having a brainstorming session. Oh, it's intense. And it's intense and we're fighting. No, you are wrong. No, you're, it's like we bring all our ideas together and how to tackle cancer cells. And every Monday, Tuesday, and Friday, I meet with the cancer team. So we design experiments in the laboratory, test hypotheses, experiments, then on computer, we design drugs, and then we go and manufacture these drugs, and then we bring them back into the laboratory and give it to mice and see if we can cure cancer. That's called preclinical research. Then the second part of my research has two flavors, which is clinical research. Clinical research means whatever I discovered here, I take them into the clinic and develop drugs and give it to patients. That's called translational research. Translational research, you translate the research into patients or humans. And then there's outcome research that once you've done that, what happens to these people? Do they live longer? Do they live shorter? What side effects happen and so forth? What happens in Afro-Americans? What happens in Hispanics? What happens in people with different ethnicities and things like that? And so that's a whole different area because not everybody reacts to chemicals the same way. So everything that I do, every single patient that I touch is part of my bigger research agenda. How do I learn from each individual patient? And so that's the kind of research I do. My most exciting research right now, because you asked, happened to be an accident. And my team was sitting like this, frustrated after 6 months. This is 2 years ago. And they were frustrated because the experiments that they were doing. So when you design an experiment, okay, you expect an outcome. You have to predict it. I'm going to go to McDonald's. Now, when you say I'm going to go to McDonald's, the implied answer to that is that you're going to go order some kind of a meal there. You're unlikely to go there and buy, hair products. So the implied is that you're going to go get something to eat there. But when you get there, all McDonald's have is hair products. And you're perplexed. That's what's happening with my team. They had designed experiments to get an answer, and they were not getting an answer. And we sat down together, and I looked at the data, and voila! In that moment, it turned out that we had stumbled onto a platform, a technique to make cancer vaccines. So now our latest research, we can take a cancer out of a patient, one single patient, we can take their cancer out, we can take their cells out, we can chop them into different kinds of pieces, make a vaccine out of that, treat the cancer patient with drugs, and then for their life, give their own vaccine to them. It's called individualized vaccine. And it's one of the most fascinating way to give cancer vaccine to patients. So it hasn't happened in patients yet because we're working on it. But all the animals that we treated with the cancer vaccine, we call them the tabbies. these vaccines, when we give them, those animals are cured. So we were very excited. And what ended up happening was last year, I started a biotech company as part of this vaccine development program. And so Mayo Clinic and myself have partnered together to develop these cancer vaccines for patients. That's one of the most exciting things.
That it's so cool to like hear that you're like on the forefront of medicine. A lot of the time the physicians we talk to are mainly in clinical, and it's so exciting. I work in a research lab here at the U to like hear that like steps are being made, and that's so it's so amazing. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I look forward to see the future of it and keeping up to date with it. How do you feel that your research and your clinical work come together in how you treat your patients?
Very good question. So I started working on cancers that were not curable. When I started in the field that I am, which is leukemias, people would live less than 2 years. And over the last 25 years, God blessed me with lots of ability to develop new drugs, many drugs. And some of them I wrote textbooks about, and you can look them up. These drugs have allowed people to live over 10 years. So we have fivefold increased their longevity. We're still far from cure in these cancers that I'm working on, but imagine when somebody was dying a year and a half into their disease versus 15. My longest is 18 years old, 18 years later. And he just came to see me a week ago at home, visited me, and he says, I'm 18 years out, I'm still living. And so those are the rewarding moments. What happens is that earlier on in my career, I decided that unless I study diligently every single case, how I can learn from them, I'm not going to make progress. So sometimes you try different things, experiments, experimental drugs. One patient I shared with you, she was a young lady. When I first saw her, she was in her late 30s, and her child was, I think, fifth or sixth grade or something. And so I tried many different things, and she was in bad shape. She went into remission, came back, and so forth. And finally, everything stopped working. And then I'm an immunologist, so I study immune system very well. I believe in immune system. That's how vaccines came into being. So as an immunologist, I said, okay, what if I play with and activate her immune system, just hyperactivate it? And so I started giving her pneumonia shots every week, just pneumonia shots, not cancer shots, just pneumonia shots. Every week I would just stimulate her immune system. Now she is 5 or 6 years late, 5 or 6 years, no treatment, no cancer, cannot detect cancer. And I see her once a year and there's no cancer in her. Every Christmas and Easter, I get this big basket of chocolates because she's a chocolatier. So that was really worked out well for me. So she makes chocolates and she sends it, then I know that she's doing very well. But the idea is that you have to think out of the box. Once you think out of the box, you have a shot at cancer. If you do exactly the same thing over and over and over, you're unlikely to make progress. And that's the mantra of our team, our group, is that what is it that we are not doing? What is it that others are not thinking? What is it that we can do that is so novel, but makes sense? It's not voodoo science and so forth. And so one of the things that I discovered, which is very, very fascinating, is a herb. It's a powdered herb called neem, and you can buy it on the Amazon for $14 a bottle. And one of my patients was taking a herb, and his leukemia was getting better. And I said, "What? I'm not doing anything to you. How are you getting better?" And so, long story short, this is a paper. If you Google my name, you'll find it. We figured out what the herb was. And now some of the leukemia patients, I just prescribe that herb and they go into remission. It's so, so simple just because you thought out of it. Now, when you do these kind of things, we got to be done scientifically because, of course, I'm a scientist. So then we took that when we saw that patients were getting into remission from a herbal, a plant, a leaf. When we took those leaves out, I got them into the lab, broke them into proteins, chopped them up, digested them, found out what exactly is it in that plant that causing remission. And then once we found it, it took us 7 years to find it. And once we found it, we cloned it, we synthesized it, and we tested it in animals, and it works beautifully. So it's phenomenally potent anti-cancer medicine that we're now developing. So the only reason I could pick that up and develop a completely new drug was because you kept your eyes open and ears open in the clinic. When somebody's saying, hey, I'm just taking a herbal medicine, are you getting into remission? And then you start digging and digging. If you are a run-of-the-mill physician, say, oh, okay, take it, don't worry about it, then you would have missed out on a discovery. But because I was listening, I said, okay, bring the bottles in. They brought the bottles in. I said, can you stop it? He stopped. The leukemia came back. I said, start it again. Started it again. And the leukemia went back into remission. So a good clinician, a good physician and scientist would listen to information, assimilate it, and bring them together.
I have a question to piggyback off of that, actually. So you said that think out of the box. And obviously you were saying that your most exciting research was an accident, like just a happy accident. Do you feel like sometimes you get to a dead end where you have zero idea where to go because you're like, I actually, I tried this, it didn't work. And if there isn't a happy accident, what is the process that you and your team go through to kind of get somewhere out of this dead end? How do you get yourself out of this?
Very, very good question. Because most of the time you are stuck. So when I'm treating incurable cancer, of course, I'm starting from a position of defeat because I'm not able to cure it. So this is how I teach my staff. Science is pure gold. It's always truthful. Nature is truthful. You are not getting the answers that you are looking for, then you're looking at the wrong answer. If you do the same experiment over and over and over again, and the results are coming consistently, but not the way that you wanted or anticipated, that means your calculations, your ideas, your science, your biology, your understanding was not correct. It's not that the science is wrong. Science is telling you something else. So you have to then step back and say, what is it that I'm missing? What did I pose the question wrong? Did I do the experiment wrong or not? And so what happens with my team is that they spend a whole week in the laboratory doing experiments like they did, and then they'll bring all the data to me, and they'll show me slides and information and data, and I'll ask them, what do you think should happen? And so we think this should happen, but it's not happening. But my mind is not, I don't let my mind get blocked by what they are saying. I don't take anybody's explanation. What I try to first do is what a scientific mind would do. If science is so true, it will always follow a path. It will never make detours. Does that make sense? And so you have to step back, ask the question again, and see whether your hypothesis was correct or not. There's always an explanation of the answers that you are getting, always.
That makes a lot of sense, and it encourages me to keep searching for answers and try to think about things in a different way. Another question we have is, how does being an oncologist and a physician scientist impact your personal life in either like a positive or a negative way?
Very, very good question. So at some point in my life, my hobby became science. I love science. Science became my hobby. It's like when you love what you do, then it's not work. So when people bring and teams bring data and information and results, I am so excited to dig in. It's like Legos to me. So when my son Matthew plays with Legos and he's building things and stuff, you'll see that joy in my eyes when the blots and the Western blots and the PCRs and all that flops up on the slide. Because in my mind is going crazy. How do you put them together? How do you bring them together and make a story out of it? And some of those are very hard things to do. So one of the cancers that I have specialized and one of the few handful, 4 or 5 people in the country who do this very rare cancer called Waldenstrom. And when I started in that field, there was just no model to study in the laboratory. And one of my patients was dying of that disease. And she said, Dr. Chanan, I am dying, but I don't want this fight to be lost. How can I help you? And she donated her body. So 3 a.m. in the morning when she passed, we took her body immediately to the morgue, cut her open. Within minutes, we had to cut her open from head to toe, took all the cancer cells and tumors out of her body, and rushed it to my laboratory by 4 a.m. There were 100+ mice waiting for them, and we chopped them in and put them into the mice so we can keep the cancer cells alive. And all those 100 mice were inoculated with cancer, but only 3 grew the cancer because the rest died. And so out of those 3 cancer mice, we developed cell lines. And those cell lines are perpetual, they live perpetually. And so now we have, for the first time in the human history, models of that particular cancer. And that cancer is phenomenally, these models are phenomenally important because they're very unique. And so sometimes you have to do all of these things, and you can see that it impacts your life. If you're up at 3 a.m. in the morning, 4 a.m. in the morning, running to the hospital, you're seeing patients, you're taking care of patients, you're also running to the laboratory. It does have a huge commitment. So when you are a researcher and a physician, depending on how passionate you are, it does impact your work-life balance. Sometimes those work-life balances are tough to deal with. Other times, if you are able to manage them, they should be and will be manageable. And so I can tell you that Matthew and I spend a lot of time together. We spend a lot of quality time together. We do things together, and we are able to manage a very healthy life.
That's awesome to hear. Thank you. One question we have is, working with vulnerable populations and people going through cancer treatments can be very, very challenging. And so we're wondering, how do you do it every day and still remain positive for your patients?
That's a tough one too. Yeah. When I was younger, it was very hard. It's not easy anymore. It's not any less easier. So when you love people and you want to take care of them, you want to help them, you want them cured, you invest every single brain cell to save one life. And you walk with these patients, especially as a cancer physician, from the time they're diagnosed to the time of their death. I stay with them. Some people, the people I took care of 23, 4 or 5 years ago, and I remember one young man, I remember his name, his wife. His child was being born when he had this horrible cancer, and he died during those months. And it was very painful. And 25 years later, still, I remember him. The other day, I was opening my Bible, and I had a brochure of a funeral of a patient that I took care of in 1995, a young 19, 20 years old gentleman who I took care of for 3, 4 years. He had a very rare disorder of bleeding disorder, and handsome young man, bled everywhere, to the point that he bled in his eyes, and his eyes became this huge chunk of tumors because of bleeding. And it was horrible how he looked, and how, but he couldn't see, he completely went blind. And so the fact that 25 years later I still have his funeral brochure with me tells you that these people take a piece of you. These, they stay with you, and it hurts sometimes a lot more than if you care. There are people, there are physicians who may not be that, but I have always practiced out of my heart. I always practice out of my mind. So I use all parts of my senses to help people. And I think that's a hard one. And oncologists suffer a lot of burnout because they care a lot and they lose a lot. And so, yeah, but it's a calling. That's why it's not a job. And you have to be called to do it.
I actually want to go off of that. Last week, our last AMSA meeting, we actually discussed physician burnout. So it's really interesting that you bring that up. How are some ways, we did hear from a physician about how he fights physician burnout in his workplace. What do you do for yourself if you feel stressed, or how do you kind of combat that, especially being in such a sensitive field of medicine where it is definitely more challenging because you are around those people that you work with for their life?
Certainly. There are some scientific tools that people do. They block off their time, they take planned vacations every 3-4 months and so forth. And then there's the spiritual part. I love the spiritual part. I rely a lot on my faith. And I believe that God has everybody a defined time. And when God is in control, I believe, then every breath is accounted for. And my job is to be there for those patients as they're going through their journey, to help them, to take their fears away, to give them hope, to treat them, to make them comfortable. If they go into remission and they have more time, they're grateful. But during this journey, I try to educate them also, not just on treatments and cures and remissions, but also that they are not going to be shortchanged of their life if they believe in God. And so for me, the way I cope with burnout has been that I was called to help people in this way. And I have to rely on the fact that God gave me certain tools to help them. And once those tools are over, then I have to rely on His greater wisdom to be able to bring these people back home into heaven. And so that helps me take care of my stresses and burnout a lot, because I push that or delegate that whole piece of mortality to a higher power.
We have one final question for you, if that's okay.
Yes.
Just because I know we're running a little short on time. So I don't really know too much about the subject, but one of our members was wondering if you have seen or if you know of any success in utilizing the modified ketogenic diet in cancer therapy.
Modified ketogenic diet. So there are many different kinds of diets, and diet do play a role in generating aberrant or abnormal cancer cells. So if we even if we leave ketogenic diet as is, but if we talk about diet in general, dietary intakes. Now, dietary intake spans a lot, and it's very important for you young folks to know that dietary intake into account not just food, carbohydrates, proteins, smoked products, raw products. There are certain kind of cancers that happen with raw products. That they do. There are certain things that happens with certain behavioral changes, such as People who get hepatitis B or C infections get liver cancers. People who smoke undoubtedly will get breast cancers and head and neck cancers and cervical cancers and things like that. There are viruses. For a long time, I researched on viruses, how the virus actually goes inside the cell and incorporates in human cells and causes mutations and causes and that's why AIDS, one of the things is that immune compromised patients get all these viral infections that cause it. Then there are parts of our dietary, if we are really obese and we have a lot of fatty tissue, a lot of steroids are there, a lot of stress is there. Um, Stress itself is as an inducer of low immunity and so forth. So all these things come into a dietary, in some dietary form, stressors to the body, and that they result in causing generation of abnormal or neoplastic or malignant cells in the body. Now, in younger folks like yourself, the body's immune system is very robust and new and active, and we get rid of a lot of these cancer cells. As aging process happens, the immune system also becomes aged, and their ability to fight back is also compromised. A ketogenic diet, meaning that you're more high protein based and so forth kind of a diet, and people say that you take the sugars away, and that allows you to have a better inner system. Part of that is true in terms of a healthy body. If you have a healthy inner body metabolism, that will help you, no doubt. But truly, the body system are so amazingly regulated that your blood sugar is always in the same range. So when people say, oh, cancer patients should not do too much sugar, I don't really pay much credence to that, because the body regulates your sugar very closely, no matter whether you eat or not. So I think the dietary, overall, my message to your colleague would be that watching your diet is good. It's very important. But I don't think necessarily that one diet over the other gives you an advantage of less predisposition to cancer.
That sounds good. Well, I know we're at our end of our time and that you have a lot to get done today. So I just want to thank you so much for speaking with us. We really appreciate it a lot. And thank you so much for your time.
Good
Yes,
job.
thanks,
Thank
Ashman.
you, Rachel. Thank you, Sarah. Have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful day, guys.
You too.